Well, hello, Rockpoint. It is good to be with you again, talking about the resurrection and the life in John chapter 11. We're going to be looking at verses 17 through 27 most specifically. But I would encourage you, if you have the time this week in your devotionals, to shift over to John chapter 11, verses 1 through 46. This is where the whole story of Jesus and the resurrection of Lazarus are. It's a fascinating story. It's theologically rich. It's a kind of playful text as well. We see Jesus and his omniscience and his ability, his authority over life and death in full display as he knows about Lazarus and his death without being told. He also displays his full humanity in the famous shortest verse, verse 35 of chapter 11. Jesus wept. But it's also kind of a playful, fun text with Mary and Martha, famously Mary, who's taken in all of what Jesus has to say, and Martha, who's off busy. But here it's actually Martha who is interested in going out to find Jesus, and it's Mary staying at home. So it's kind of a fun text. It's spiritually enriching. It's challenging. So I would challenge you all to engage in John chapter 11, kind of the whole text, where we will get a broader context for the story. We will get a broader context for what it looks like for Jesus to be the resurrection and the life. And now, as we go into this, I just want to quickly, I think it's always helpful to define terms, especially in John's gospel, where certain words get used in a variety of ways. So Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. So what does he mean by life? What does he mean by resurrection? Some of these questions are asking, what does Jesus mean when he's talking about life? That's a little bit of a briefer question than what he means when he's talking about resurrection. So let's answer, what does Jesus mean when he's talking about life? Well, if we engage in this passage, if we read kind of specifically when Martha starts to talk to Jesus, verses 21 and 22, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, he will give you. And then Jesus responds, your brother will rise from the dead. John's gospel also talks about abundant life. And so perhaps we can read this text and wonder, which kind of life is Jesus talking about? Is it spiritual life in the face of spiritual death? Or is it something a little bit more mundane? And I think it's actually the more mundane. I think that's what they're talking about here when Jesus is talking about life, because he's talking about it in the face of very, very literal death. That'll be important as we conceptualize what it means for Jesus to be the resurrection and the life moving forward. But what is Jesus talking about when he's talking about resurrection? Now, this is a bigger question, and it forces us to engage a little bit with what's going on in first century Judaism. And so let's talk about what's going on in first century Judaism. There's a few different kinds of Judaism, or a few different movements within Judaism at the time of Jesus. The two most famous kinds of Judaism, you will recognize the name of, though the others are also in the New Testament. They are just less prominent. Two most famous kinds of Judaism would be the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And these are different kinds of movement, both of which engage with Jesus throughout his ministry. And it's important for us to understand how Jesus relates to these movements, to understand what Jesus is up to when he says, I am the resurrection and the life. So what is a Sadducee? Well, in short, they believe that the law will help Israel achieve holiness as they live out their covenant with God, but they're very, very strict about this. This is really located in the city of Jerusalem. They're concerned with the temple. They're concerned with really only the law. So when it comes to the Hebrew scriptures, they're only really reading the books of Moses, those first five, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And as a result, they've kind of got this restrictive view of the Bible where the resurrection from the dead maybe isn't as prominent in the books of Moses as it is in the rest of the Old Testament. So they just don't believe it. And we have two glimpses of Jesus and then Paul in the New Testament engaging with the Sadducees. The first is in Matthew chapter 22, where Jesus is questioned by the Sadducees. But what does this whole resurrection thing actually mean? And the second instance of the Sadducees engaging with the followers of Jesus is in Acts chapter 23, where Paul is questioned by a group of both Pharisees and Sadducees. And Paul and Jesus both pretty much answer the same way, saying, we believe in a resurrection from the dead. And in Jesus' case, this has the Sadducees kind of satisfied and they wander off. And in Paul's case, this actually starts a violent uproar between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And Paul can kind of get away with little to no consequences. But why? Who are these Pharisees now that are interacting with this situation? The Pharisees, they're also interested in following the law, but they're not as strict. They're not as restrictive as the Sadducees. Jerusalem isn't necessarily quite as prominent. These guys are the guys who have synagogues across the Roman world so that Jews from across the Roman world can worship. They're also interested in reading and using the entire Old Testament, not just the books of Moses. And because they're using the entire Old Testament, they do affirm the resurrection. Now, we tend to know as Christians, the Pharisees are more famous than the Sadducees. We tend to know these Pharisees as being kind of the New Testament antagonists. But I'd like to suggest that the reason they are the antagonists isn't because they are the bad guys. Rather, they are the antagonists because Jesus is interested in identifying as a part of that movement and then reforming that movement. Perhaps now it is starting to become clear why the Sadducees kind of leave Jesus and Paul alone when they say, we believe the resurrection. The Sadducees may as well be hearing Jesus and Paul say, don't get mad at me. I'm just doing the same thing as those Pharisees you've already learned to coexist with. And so now that it seems like Jesus and Paul and the followers of Jesus are kind of like the Pharisees, well, then what's the big deal? Why is there all this conflict between the Pharisees and the followers of Jesus? The Sadducees and Jesus are fighting about the resurrection and whether it even is something that's going to happen. But for the Pharisees and Jesus, the conflict isn't about whether the resurrection will happen. It's about where in the history of God's relationship with his people they actually were meant to find themselves. The Old Testament scriptures, perhaps most famously in Daniel chapter 12, express that when the last days come, the dead will rise up out of their graves. And so this is why Jesus and the Pharisees affirm a resurrection, but it happens at the end of time, the end times. This is how we know the end times will arrive. And so for the Pharisees, that time was off in the future, way away, but not now. Whereas for Jesus, he believed that he was here to make the end times now. And the scriptures talk so much about this. Jesus in Mark chapter 1 comes preaching the gospel saying, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. When Jesus is questioned in Matthew chapter 9 about why his followers don't fast, the answer is, well, they're not waiting for him. He's here and he's now. And this is what gets Jesus into trouble with his disciples, but with the Sadducees, when they put him on trial, they're not drilling him on his theology. They're actually just trying to figure out if he really believes he is the guy that they are waiting for, that he is bringing in the end times. And that was a hard thing for him to believe. And so with all of this in mind, we're starting to get, this is what Jesus means with life. This is what he means with resurrection. Let's reread the text that we're dealing with, and let's see if we can draw out some practical meaning from it. John 11, verse 17. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb for 4 days. That's Lazarus. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 15 stadia away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and to Mary to console them about their brother. So then, Martha, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise from the dead. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Martha said to him, yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, and he who comes into the world. This is our text, and there's so many interesting things to pay attention to. Notice Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And Martha interprets this well as a claim to be divine when she says, I have come to believe that you are the one who comes into the world, that you are the Son of God, and so on. I think there's kind of three practical things that I would like for us to reflect on from this text, though. Because Jesus is the resurrection and the life, that means some things for us and for our faith. First, Jesus being the resurrection and the life means that the key to Christianity is the presence of Jesus. If you follow this conversation and if you're tracking with me what the difference between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Sadducees actually is, Martha is contributing to that conversation in interesting ways. She's having this conversation much like Jesus would be having this same conversation with a Pharisee. They agree on theology. The resurrection is happening at the end of time, but she's not grasping what it means that Jesus is standing in front of her. The fact that Jesus is there now means that we are immediately expecting the resurrection of the dead, and we shouldn't fear that Lazarus has died because he will rise on the last day, which is now. Again, this looks a lot like how Jesus would be having this conversation with a Pharisee. And that's why maybe it seems like they're talking a little bit past each other. Jesus says, Lazarus will rise from the dead. And Martha gets that, but he has to then know, I am the resurrection and the dead. And the reason they're talking past each other is because Martha, like the Pharisees, don't get that truth isn't a thing to be grasped way out there. It's a person standing right in front of her. Historically, and I like this, I like theology, and Christians have considered theology to be a science. But it gets complicated because it's a science which is unique because it's trying to put this infinite, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God under the microscope of our minds, which are incomplete and broken. And so, what do we do then if we're trying to cram this God under this microscope, but he's actually standing there trying to tap you on the shoulder? I think that's kind of what's going on here, where Martha gets what's true in the midst of her grief, in the midst of the loss of her brother, but she doesn't understand what it means that Jesus is bringing in the resurrection right then and there, and that he's standing right then and there. It's actually this that makes Christianity different than the Judaism it was born out of. It takes the good revelation that God has given us, and it says he's right here. Follow him. And I think probably a lot of us are starting to conceptualize what this means. Yeah, okay, this presence of Jesus is really important to pay attention to in the face of whatever it is that I deem as important about being a Christian. And so I think our gut reaction is to start to rank our priorities as Christian. The presence of Jesus is better than fill in the blank. Maybe it's he seems like he's better than the truths found in the scriptures, or a life of spiritual discipline, or the care that I might have for my neighborhood. And that's an interesting endeavor, but that's just not where Jesus goes at all with this. And that, I think, accidentally creates a kind of internal monologue where I might start to actually think those things aren't important, even though Jesus actually does think those things are good. Jesus just isn't going to this ranking thing. He's just saying he wants her to recognize who's standing in front of her, and all of these good, true, beautiful things in her life actually just point to him. This means that your good theology, your good marriage, your good work-life balance, your healthy church, your good whatever it is that you're aiming for, they are indeed good, but they're not ends in themselves. Jesus is an end in himself. But in this either-or mentality that we sometimes have, we often throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so we hear Jesus is the end, not these, and we throw these good things out. And again, Jesus just isn't going there. These things are still good, and it's because they point to Jesus. He's engaging in all of these things. He promotes good theology. He promotes good marriages. He promotes healthy churches. He promotes good work-life balance. Let us therefore not become Christians who have this cluttered spirituality, aiming at anything for its own sake, but aiming at Jesus. And to know Jesus is to know his benefits. He's creating all of this fruit in your life. He will do that. Jesus being the resurrection and the life means that we need the presence of Jesus. And we see that here in his conversation with Martha. It also means, Jesus being the resurrection and the life, means that death no longer has the final say. As we have already covered, Jesus is speaking very, very literally about life and about death here. And there's a pretty clear hope because of that, that he's offering to Martha in the face of her brother's death. Lazarus will rise from the dead. Thus, some of the implications here are pretty straightforward. There is hope in death because death isn't final. But I think there's also a little bit more going on here that's important to pay attention to. Notice what Jesus doesn't say here in this text. He doesn't say, I am the life. He doesn't say, I am the life and the resurrection. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. He's not promising us life in the face of death on its own, or he's not promising us just life as such. He's actually promising us life through death, then resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. And the scriptures teach us that the wages of sin is death. We know this. So every person has to die as a consequence for their sins. But I think when we look at the way that death and the way we conceptualize death, we see it as this curse. And we kind of understand that, but that's just not how Jesus is interacting with death here. He isn't worried by death. He isn't considering it this curse. He's actually welcoming it. He's not stopping it. He engages in it. He weeps. He feels its consequences. And then he raises Lazarus from the dead, just like this. And so this has caused Christians to observe that while both being a consequence of the fall and a reality we will be delivered from, death may actually be a necessary part of God's world now. Think about it like this. It's the same way that the law back in the Old Testament was given because of the sin problem, but it's also good and has a place in God's plan for redemption. We still also, though, wouldn't have it without sin. It's this weird thing where because of sin, we have this thing, but it's good and it serves a purpose. Romans 5 is all about this, and I would encourage you to check out that. And the law and sin have this interesting relationship. But death gets wrapped up in that as well, because death has something to teach us now, much like the law and how it has a role because of sin. Death has a role because of sin. Thinking along these lines, St. Maximus the Confessor writes that because of sin, the law of death was given to curb our folly. It's teaching us something in the face of our brokenness. And if this is therefore the relationship we're meant to have with death, where on one hand, yes, there's hope because there's life after death, but also death is teaching us something. How are we supposed to live with this? I've just got a few practical things here. I think first, it gives us hope. We should have hope because death isn't final. We can look at it, we can look at the grief and the tragedies that will come in this life, and we can have hope that we will see our loved ones once again. And some of us need to hold on to that hope. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. You will see them again. We need to hold on to that. It also means, though, that because death is teaching us something, we should actually embrace that and learn from death. And I've only had a little bit of experience with death at this point in my life, but I have enough to have learned a few lessons from death. The first of which, if I can just enunciate them briefly, is that life is precious. So often death happens unexpectedly. And then there's all of this shame and guilt and regret. If only I had said this sooner, or had spent more time doing this with that person, I wouldn't feel this guilt right now. Death teaches us that life is precious. And then it also teaches us that the people in our life are precious. How often do you have someone pass and realize how important they were? You grieve more than you expected. Or maybe you grieve appropriately and you just miss the people in your life. Take them seriously, surround yourself with them. And if the people in your life are precious, and if life is precious, then that also means that you are precious. And let death teach you that. And let yourself receive the respect that inspires. Take that seriously. So often in my social media, this happens from time to time, where I'm scrolling and I bump into a video or a post of some sort that says, hey, by the time you die, you will have spent X many years asleep, X many years watching TV, X many years sitting on the toilet, all of these kinds of things. And it freaks me right out. And I think there's a point to that. That is a good thing, not to be fearful of death, but to go, I should use this time wisely. I think this is why in Psalm 90, Moses tells us, teach us, O Lord, to number our days. Death is teaching us something. Jesus, being the resurrection and the life, does teach us both that there is hope in the face of death, but that death is not something we should be afraid of. It's defeated, and it has a role in this life. We've all encountered death in some capacity already. There is grief in death, and that is good. Jesus weeps. Let us not lose sight of that. But I also wonder if we have a call to take death seriously and to invite the things it tries to teach us into our life and live more intentionally. The third thing that I think Jesus, being the resurrection and the life, teaches us is from the end of our text here, where Jesus asks, after saying, I am the resurrection and the life, he then closes that thought with, Martha, do you believe this? And her answer is, yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, and he who comes into this world. And this strikes me as really, really important, because even in the face of grief, Jesus has concern for Martha, and he wants to get her to make a profession of belief. asking her, do you believe this? He later in verse 40 actually holds her accountable to what she had said in the previous conversation. He wants to open up Lazarus's tomb so he can raise Lazarus from the dead, and she tries to stop him. He goes, didn't you say that you believe? Reminding her of her confession. This word belief is a really, really important word. It's typically translated as faith, but is probably best translated as trust. It's kind of a squishy word with a wide semantic range, but trust seems to be best. Sometimes hope and these kinds of things. And it is this kind of trust in God that Abraham had when he believed in God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. This is what makes us good with God. This is what makes us right with God. And this is why Jesus is so interested in asking, what does Martha believe? Does she trust Jesus? And as the story progresses, like I said, it's this trust that Martha has expressed that Jesus holds her accountable to. But it has so many things. There's so many times in this text that Jesus uses this word trust, this word faith, this word believe. And so let's just look at all of the things that it says here in the rest of this chapter. Verse 25, anyone who has faith in me will live even if he dies. Verse 26, anyone who has faith will never die. Verse 40, if you believe, you will see God's glory. Verse 42, a little different, but Jesus actually prays out loud to inspire the faith of those around him. Verse 45, once Lazarus has been raised, many had faith. This whole story is about faith in Jesus and is designed to inspire faith in Jesus. And then John, at the end of John's gospel, verse 31 of chapter 20, says that he wrote this whole book, John's gospel, so that the readers, us and his immediate audience, would have faith. And Jesus, in the midst of Martha's grief, asks to get that faith from her. This is important. This is so important. We shouldn't miss this. And if it was important for Jesus to get that in the face of Martha's grief, if this is why John wrote this gospel, then I think it's important for us to reflect on this. And so I've just got a couple questions. It's the same question every time, but based on the things that we have talked about, it seems important to me that we ask if we believe Jesus when he says he is the resurrection and the life. So let's ask these questions. Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and if you believe in him, you will live even if you die. Do you believe this? Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and therefore you will never die if you believe in him. Do you believe this? Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and therefore if you believe in him, you will see God's glory. Do you believe this? Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and therefore through faith, death has no power. Do you believe this? Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and therefore when you face death, it is not final if you believe. Do you believe this? Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and therefore death is no longer a curse for the Christian, but it has something to teach us. Do you believe this? Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and therefore his presence is what every good, true, and beautiful thing points to. Do you believe this? And notice how Martha answers this question. I have come to believe this. This isn't an easy belief. It isn't an instant belief, but it's where Jesus is slowly taking us. And like I said, it's once Martha makes this confession to Jesus that, yes, I believe, that as the story progresses, as Jesus continues to do the things that he does, he holds her accountable to what she has said up to this point. Because she has made this confession, he can ask questions, he can inspire growth, he can challenge, correct, and mold his people. And even in the face of Martha's doubt, she's trying to stop him from opening the tomb. He can work with that. Jesus, therefore, being the resurrection and the life, calls us to check our own beliefs. Jesus can transcend them, and he surely will. But we need to be a people who confess to the Lord where we are at. What do we believe? What have we come to believe about you, Jesus, at this point? And as we make that confession, he is at work. And so I'd like to close just in prayer with us confessing to the Lord who we believe, who we have come to believe that he is. And as we do, I'd encourage you to pray along with me, because I think if we do, the Lord will hold us accountable to these things. He will hold us in life. He will work in the midst of where we've told him we are at with him. Let's pray. Jesus, we believe that you are the great I am, that you are God. Because you are God, all things are possible. So Jesus, we trust you and ask that you would work in our lives. Jesus, we believe that you are the light of the world. And because you are the light of the world, there is no darkness too dark for you to work in. Jesus, we believe that you are the bread of life. Because you are the bread of life, we will always be satisfied. Jesus, we believe that you are the door. Because you are the door, because you are the good shepherd, we have the best leader caring for us. You are the one who protects the flock. You are the one who keeps us where we're meant to be. We believe you are the good shepherd. We also believe that you are the way, the truth, and the life, providing for us truth, providing for us the way, providing for us life and life abundant, and very, very real life in the face of death. We also believe that you are the true vine, and from you we receive our growth. We believe that you are the resurrection and the life, that death does not have the final say, that through faith you will work in our lives. And Jesus, we just ask that you would continue to work in us. We believe these things, and we want to see these things made known in our lives and in the lives of those around us. So we pray all of these things in your powerful name, Jesus. Amen.